Hi, I'm Ashley and this is Crafty with Ashley. Today I am showing you the process of painting a kind of rundown barn that looks like it's set in Kansas with this big sunflower just really boldly in front of it. And I called this restoration just because, even though things can get run down over time, just like flowers, they can die off and then they can come back and be restored beautifully. So I just started with a sketch here, very simple pencil sketch, really. So I did some kind of loose circles to mark out where the sunflower is going to be in the front. And so I did the very center and then a circle around it for kind of the larger center part, and then just a loose circle for where the petals are going to end. And then I sketched the barn then behind it, and basically just start with one line using, either real life or a reference photo. Just choose one line to start with and then build up from there. And your verticals are going to be vertical, right? This building is straight up and down. So those verticals are straight up and down. And then the horizontals are where you need to really work on the perspective of it. But this is a pretty simple shape overall. It's just basically rectangles and triangles. So break it down into those shapes. Now for the pencil lines, I am loosely adding in like the slats of wood for the sides of this barn. And you can see I'm holding the pencil very far back, and that's just letting me keep my hand loose, kind of moving my whole arm to get those vertical lines fairly straight. They're definitely interrupted lines, nothing precise here. And then I am making some of the lines darker and bolder to look like there's some gaps in these slats. And so I'm not going to rub out these pencil marks. I'm going to use them to help create depth in this painting and texture, basically. So same thing on the sides, just turn my paper so that I can get a more natural movement for my arm. And then just worked on, same thing, putting some thicker lines here and there. And then I put in some little domes there, basically half circles, and erased around them or inside them, because those are going to be some white flowers that I wanted to make sure I painted around. And then again, just kind of loosely sketching in, I actually started to sketch petals, and then I decided that I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to use the brush. So now I'm tapping in color here and doing the sky. And so just going in on a dry page. So this is wet on dry, very wet. And I just threw in that color. And then now I'm using lifting technique. So kind of dried the brush off some and just lifting out some of that wet paint. As the page dries more, less will be lifted. So you can get some variety there. And then I just took some paper towel and tapped out some additional kind of cloud shapes just to get a little bit of harder edges compared to the lifting technique with the paintbrush. So then after finishing the sky, I wanted to get in that front sunflower. So I'm just mixing up some kind of orange tones, very yellow, warm though, real warm yellow. So leaning toward orange, just added a tiny bit of magenta to my yellow. And then just going in with the brush and doing kind of a press and drag and lift to get that shape. So turning my hand and turning the brush as I go around the page to keep the shape of the petals consistent to a petal shape, but they're all slightly different and have some variety. And then just going in another round kind of in between and on top of those petals to get a little bit more fullness and depth there. And kind of varying the colors just a little bit too. So adding some more oranges and a little bit of browns just to vary the color. And then tapping in one additional layer that's much more heavily brown. I guess it's kind of like a yellow ochre color. I didn't have yellow ochre in my palette at this point, so I just kind of mixed it up. But around the center, I wanted it to be a bit more of a darker color. And then I just went in with kind of a base light brown for the center and tapped in some darker color. And that was just to get some start of some texture on the center of the sunflower. I didn't want to go crazy yet, not adding detail, but just get some base color and throw in some texture. And then I'm going in and painting these largest, most in focus leaves. So everything else in terms of the field behind the sunflower is going to be a lot less detailed, but these are my kind of very foreground elements that are the most detailed. Still loose, but much more detailed than everything behind it. So just getting in, again, kind of that base color, tapping in some color wet on wet to get just a little bit of variety. Same thing with the stem, just getting that nice thick sunflower stem in and making sure that it looks like it's going up straight toward like the center in the back of that sunflower. And then again, added some depth and shadow greens into that stem while it was still wet to get a nice soft blend. So once I add all those colors, just mixing up additional colors for the center of the sunflower here. And so I'm going in and doing kind of tapping motions. I'm just doing little dots, polka dots basically, and going around the circle where there's like a change in depth on sunflowers. There's, it's all one center, but it looks like two rings. So getting that delineation in first and just tapping around. Literally, I just tapped around that whole circle over and over and varied the colors values up a little bit. Some are lighter, some are darker. And then did the same thing on the inside, but just allowing that, difference. It's just getting that deep shadow of that inner circle just helps create that depth. So, that's shadows are really important to create depth. That's the only way that you can really create depth in a two-dimensional painting is to do shadows and to do perspective, which on a flower, there's not that much perspective here. So it's mostly the shadows. And then just mixing up this kind of pale, kind of like hay, straw-y color to paint in this field. And as I come toward the front, so toward the bottom of the page, I'm just varying the color and the brush strokes a little bit. So instead of going horizontal like I did toward the back, I start going more vertical to look like it's like grasses or wheats or something growing up. And as I get farther to the front, also, toward the bottom of the page, I start just mixing in some blues into that color. So it's that same yellow initial color, and then I'm just adding a little bit of blue to make it shift gradually from that golden yellow to green, basically. And so in the front, it's still going to be a very neutral color, but it's much more green compared to the back. And that just creates variety also. So again, shadows and perspective are ways to create depth. The third main way is creating that illusion of detail closer, and then farther back is less detailed. So by doing the brush strokes horizontally and making it look a little bit flatter, you can't see the detail of the grasses or the wheats or whatever this is. And adding some more brush strokes in the foreground helps create that depth as well. So again, just basically doing that through the foreground and then mixing up the kind of base roof color, which is just gray essentially, and just getting a very light wash of gray on the roof, using a little bit of dry brushing technique just to create some texture, and then mixing up a stronger gray, slightly stronger gray for the other side, which is really the underside of that part of roof, right? Because again, now we're looking at perspective. So that's really just shadowed. So just creating that darker, deeper color. Now, at this point, I'm mixing up reds. I don't have red in this palette. So I am mixing with magenta and some browns and some oranges, and adding even just a little bit of blue in there to make it lean a little more toward a purpley red. So just mixing all those colors together to get a good barn color that I wanted. Now this barn, again, it's old, it's kind of dilapidated. So the paint's chipping off and wearing off and very weathered. So I'm using dry brushing technique to allow the white of the paper to kind of peek through the red. So holding the brush very like flat to the page. So instead of the brush being vertical, it's much more horizontal. And then I'm just letting the bristles kind of scrape across the page and being selective in kind of where I'm choosing to do that based on where the paint's more chipped off and where it's more, I don't know, dense, I guess, less chipped off. So on the front of the barn, there's basically a big white gray patch. So letting that stay mostly white. And then on the side, there's much more paint. And on that little offshoot on the right side, I don't know what it's called, but again, same thing. There's much more paint. So for the side of the barn, it's in shadow. So I did mix up a much more kind of like purpley brown red for that side to create that shadow and that depth. And then just went in and added a stronger color on the roof, but still using that dry brushing technique. And so this was still kind of like dry brush on a dry page and just allow it to pick up texture. And then again, much stronger color on the shadow there and filled in that little window hole. Sorry about the focus. Sometimes the camera picks up my hand instead of the paper, so it drives me a little bit crazy. So sorry, I'm sure it drives some of you crazy as well. Okay, so back to it though. Just again, adding more and more texture and just building up the layers of paint, just continuing dry brushing though. So each layer, you're going to see some of the previous layers still, and you're going to see the whites. And then just mixed up super light wash of gray to create depth to the weathered, paint-free part of the building. And then again, just adding more of that shadowy red color, kind of varying the direction of the brush strokes a little bit, and then adding in that shadow underneath where the roof overhang is. So that helps, again, create that depth. The shadows help just make things pop off the page a little bit more. So just by adding that, you can tell now that the roof overhangs the front. It's not just a flat surface. And so same thing on that little angled part off to the side, just adding in that shadow. And because the colors dry lighter, watercolor dries lighter, you might need to go in and strengthen some of those colors here and there. Don't be afraid to add contrast. Contrast is what's really going to make your piece pop off the page. So that's, I guess, my tidbit for this. And then just going in and adding in some details on the barn. This is a angle brush. So Princeton Select brushes have pretty snappy, like firm bristles. They're not real soft and floppy. So they're really good for details and just like this dagger brush, not dagger brush, angle. I think they call it an angle shader. It's just really good to create super fine lines and details. So then with creating some of those shadows around the door frame and under that little awning, again, it just creates that depth. And then just adding some vertical and horizontal gray, basically. Now I go back in, this is a fine liner brush, and just going in and adding in details on the sunflower to separate some of those petals and create some like vein textures. And you can see how that really made that pop to the foreground, just adding those details. And then I do the same thing with the leaf. So just adding more darks, a little bit more shadowy colors on the leaves, and some vein illusions, I guess. And just using my liner brush for that. And some yellow. Yellow is pretty opaque, so it can layer a little bit. And then darker greens also. And then just going back in and framing the painting just a little bit by adding this hint of a tree. So this is dry brushing also pretty much. So I mixed up this green color and then my brush is dry, and you can see I actually separate the bristles on the paintbrush a bit and then vary the direction that I'm pointing the brush and that my hand's facing to create just this illusion of foliage without much effort. And then using a liner brush to create some thin kind of wobbly lines for branches, just kind of generally thinking that it's coming kind of from above and off the page on the right, and everything's kind of angling down into the page. And then added white gouache for all of those flowers, and I just did the same thing that I did for the tree. Just took my brush, mostly dry, and kind of tapped around to add brush. And then with the fan brush, I'm adding some darker greens and kind of swiping up to create that more grassy texture. Again, same thing here with adding more white gouache. And so white gouache is more opaque than watercolor, still not completely opaque, but much more opaque. And just adding that and kind of feathering it out to create these little white flowers. I don't know what they are. And then just adding some stems with the liner brush. And all of that just creates some depth and somewhere for your eye to track, from the sunflower back toward the barn and curving in kind of around back toward the barn. And it just creates some interest in the painting. So just touching up some final details where I had the pencil marks. You could see the pencil marks still where they were thicker, but I just wanted them to be a little bit more bold. So adding some darker grays into the barn to, again, just create that detail and kind of make those gaps in the wood pop out a little bit more. And just, I don't know, I just wanted it to be a little bit higher contrast there. So added a much darker gray color to that. And then I felt like the roof just needed one more layer of gray, and adding, same thing, a little bit more gray shadows here and there. So this is really just the final touch-up phase of what do I feel like needs a little more color, a little more shadow, a little more contrast. And taking a step back here and there to really observe the painting and make sure that you're adding things where you want it and not overworking it. Usually it's shadows and maybe some fine lines. So just going in one more time with the gouache just to make those have a little more impact and a little bit more bold white. And that's it. So this is my painting restoration, and this is my view of kind of a Kansas barn. I hope you really enjoyed this time lapse. If you did, you should check out my channel for other painting tutorials and inspiration. Thanks so much for watching. Have an awesome day.